In recent weeks, there has been much made of the success of the National Cabinet, as it has steered Australia through the COVID-19 pandemic. Australians have been reassured as politicians of all stripes have put aside their partisan views to make the decisions necessary to save lives. The broad consensus, the incorporation of experts advising on the best way forward, has been acclaimed as the path for the future. Team Australia is the chorus. Let's keep the National Cabinet to coordinate the economic recovery and implement a new wave of economic reform. So let's put the National Cabinet under the spotlight. The most fundamental issue facing the National Cabinet is that it has no constitutional foundation whatsoever. It's not an elected body. It's not answerable to any parliament. And while most parliaments are currently suspended, there is zero ability to test the merits of its proposals. So why does the National Cabinet still exist? First, the public still believe the pandemic needs a coordinated response. Second, as Paul Keating once famously said, never stand between a premier and a bucket of money. And each of the premiers know that they need federal money to bail out their state budgets over the next 12 months to 2 years. The third, and most unstated, is self-interest. Each of the players wants to hide behind the concept of the National Cabinet just in case something goes wrong. They want to say the National Cabinet agreed to this path. Now, increasingly, politicians want to use unelected experts as their human shields when things go wrong to deflect the blame from themselves. Exhibit A in this crisis, the Ruby Princess. And if you dare to criticise the unelected official, you are against Team Australia. So Australians should remain sceptical when it hears the call from vested interests that we need to keep an unelected body to oversee our economic recovery. Hell, why don't we just gather 1,000 of the brightest Australians together at Parliament House to ask them their views? Oh, someone tried that once. A vibrant democracy requires alternate views to be heard. Australians will sacrifice aspects of this when we are faced with a pandemic or a bushfire emergency or a war to save lives. But our social contract revolves around a consent to be governed that includes protecting our democratic values and institutions, even when inconvenient. So it's time to say thank you to the National Cabinet for its good work and return to our elected parliaments and their inconvenient processes. Now I'd like to bring in Antoinette to see what she thinks about that.
Well, I always try and begin by saying something positive. And what I will say is I think that Scott Morrison is doing a good job. I think he's redeemed himself from his handling of the bushfire crisis and that notorious Hawaiian trip. I also think he's come a long way from the kind of jumbled and confusing communication at the beginning of this pandemic, and I think he'll be remembered favourably in the history books at this because of this time and because of his pragmatism and that he's been willing to go against the grain in some of his policies. I also think that the National Cabinet was needed, and I think it's also easy to appear united when really there's one single adversary, one huge sort of global issue that everybody's tackling. But once life begins to resume, as we've seen with the social restrictions easing, I, like you, Stephen, question whether or not we need the National Cabinet moving forward. It has been nice to see bipartisanship for the most part. It's been nice to also not see political infighting within political parties. Prior to this, it was hard to keep up. It was almost like an episode of Days of Our Lives. You didn't know who was on whose side and where politicians, let alone parties, stood on particular issues. And it's interesting you mentioned that obviously they need the federal purse, but a lot of the response to the pandemic comes down to the states because it's, if you think about it, it's policing, it's education, it's schooling. And so there does have to be, obviously, work with the federal government. But I would also question, while I would say bipartisanship has worked for the most part. There have been instances, and you still see where, for example, Dutton still takes swipes at the unions. The Federal Education Minister takes swipe at Daniel Andrews. Daniel Andrews still wants to kind of double down and show that he's in charge when he refers to the three-step plan as a menu, something a bit a la carte. He'll pick and choose. Whereas just about an hour earlier, you heard from the Prime Minister saying this is our way out. So for the most part, it has worked to date, but I agree with you. I don't think it's the way forward. Very soon, our premiers and chief ministers are going to go returning to their constituents and their policy lines. And as you say, it's not constitutional. There's no way to hold it to account.
Corey, your thoughts?
Stephen, I'm marking this day down in my diary, the 10th of May, 2020, because I absolutely agree with you 100%. And I think that's probably the first time that we've ever publicly done that. But honestly, this national cabinet, it was put together, and I think with good intentions, right? Because you need to have coordinated response. But it does have no jurisdiction. It's just a glorified COAG meeting without the argy-bargy until they start saying, well, hang on, you've got to follow the agreed protocol, and then you get these clowns, and I call him a clown quite genuinely. That's your premier in Victoria,
please,
Daniel
Corey,
Andrews,
Corey.
who just does not want to do anything that will upset his own union base. He is just a disgrace in that sense. And Antoinette, you say Peter Dutton's having a crack at the unions and stuff. This national emergency, a pandemic or anything else, doesn't give people a free pass from criticism. We should be able to rip into people for really dumb decisions that they're making.
I absolutely agree. But in terms of people saying that this is bipartisanship, they're working really well together, I think what's happening is Scott Morrison is allowing he's playing good cop, and then Dutton and his education minister come in and play bad cop, and then continue to use the rhetoric and play to their constituents and continue towing the party line. So They haven't suspended politics.
Politics is the art of achieving stuff as well, and they're doing that very, very well. And, Catherine would know that politics is part war, isn't it, Catherine?
Indeed it is, and we went through 2 global wars without our parliament sat right through it. We held elections, we held plebiscites over conscription in the Great War. Democracy doesn't have to take a holiday. This process, I can understand how we stumbled into it, but I'm with Stephen. Let's get out of it as soon as possible. The Parliament reconvenes here this week. The People's House needs to start doing the people's business and get on with it. And another great quote of Paul Keating's, for those who knew him, was, never nurse a mug, they'll die in your arms. And that applies to the premiers, particularly the 2 most populous states, because the Commonwealth wears all the risk in terms of published statistics on the economic performance. In terms of unemployment numbers, it's wearing massive unsustainable deficit financing going forward, and the premiers are like the overgrown kids who've moved back into their parents' house, all care, no responsibility. They spend it like drunken sailors on leave from the Ruby Princess in Manila, and they're unaccountable at the ballot box for the outcome. So I think wind it up. Let's get back to if we got through the darkest days of 1942 with a normal government process, including the High Court of Australia upholding the uniform tax case, let's get on with business and have the People's House reconvene. I'm with you 100%, Stephen.